With the release of Doom Eternal, I can't help but remember a time when nobody cared about the franchise. Before the announcement of Doom 2016, Doom was nothing but a memory of a time when gaming was much simpler. A truly innovative and legendary game with a strong sequel, lost to the sands of time. But wait, wasn't there a third Doom? Yes, unfortunately, there was. In 2004, a decade after Doom 2's release, id Software finally released Doom 3. Despite receiving strangely positive reception at release, Doom 3 was still a massive disappointment to any real fans of the franchise, or even just shooters in general. What apparently began as a remake of Doom somehow became an incredibly mediocre horror game chock full of cheap jump scares, generic and repetitive combat, and not an ounce of subtlety. I don't have a problem with id Software taking Doom in a different direction, but nobody involved with the game understood the fundamentals of horror as a genre. The game plays like the developers were afraid that the player would get bored if they weren't constantly firing their weapon. You would think the devs would have been inspired by the Alien movies, especially Aliens, given that the concept is basically the same. But other than the Marines dying horribly, there's no connection. It's a shame because horror and space go so well together. You know what game did understand horror though? Dead Space. Before being brutally violated by EA and then mercilessly old yellered before its time, Dead Space was the greatest action horror game of the last console generation. Released just 4 years after Doom 3, Dead Space successfully blended satisfying fast-paced combat with a terrifying atmosphere almost perfectly. Dead Space is the game that Doom 3 should have been. Glenn Schofield, the creator and director of Dead Space, said he was influenced by the Resident Evil and Silent Hill games, and he couldn't have picked better franchises. I highly recommend watching the Ars Technica interview if you want to know more about the creative process behind the game. But first, let's take a look at how Doom 3 failed and how Dead Space continues to be one of the greatest horror games of all time.
I don't know what we're up against. Help me. We have negative ID on the assailing force. Have a clear
Normally, I would break down game mechanics first, but a horror game's primary focus should be to scare you by any means necessary. The problem with consistently scaring people is a little thing in our primate brains called pattern recognition. You have to constantly keep us on our toes by throwing unique situations and subverting our expectations. There are countless ways to achieve this. I'm not going to claim to be an expert on the nature of fear, but if there's one thing I do know, it's what scares me and why. So, maybe Doom 3 scares you. That's okay. I'm not going to tell you that you're wrong for being scared, but Dead Space surpasses it in just about every category. Let's start with the monsters. I'm just going to be blunt. Demons aren't scary. Not for any religious reasons. I just think visually, they don't instill any kind of terror from their typical portrayal in media. Doom 3 doesn't break from the mold either, with boring enemy types like zombies, possessed soldiers, and imps that look like generic gray aliens. Most of the other demon types look like action game monsters, with no effort to make them scary in any way. The Mancubus, Hell Knight, and Revenant just look cool, not scary. The Cacodemon looks especially terrible, like a floating nutsack with a brain poking out. Ironically, the scariest enemy is probably the Lost Soul, a floating human head that looks disturbingly uncanny. Too bad it's barely a threat. The Pinkies and Chainsaw guys are a little scary too, but they only appear a couple of times and are also fairly easy to kill. Pretty weak effort overall on Doom's side. Dead Space, on the other hand, has disgustingly disturbing enemies. The nature of the necromorphs, to morph and mutate their hosts into living weapons while still appearing human-like, is enough to make your skin crawl. It's a great utilization of the uncanny valley and body horror. The bog standard slasher necromorph is probably the scariest, at resembling a human the most out of the enemy list. There's something deeply unsettling about their bones being snapped and somehow extended into blades to tear you to shreds. They also make strange, choking-like gargling screams as they sprint toward you. The Leapers are also creepy, having lost their legs and gained a bladed tail to replace it. They crawl on walls and can run and leap impossibly far, often appearing in zero-gravity segments to ruin your day while solving puzzles. The Lurkers are especially notable for being one of the few instances in video games where you can actually kill babies, even if they're alien zombie babies. I can't believe this game wasn't banned in Germany or Australia. This is one of the few times I can say I'm both sad and horrified. You kill a shit ton of them too. A necromorph boss that's scary for an entirely different reason is the Regenerator. Definitely inspired by Nemesis of Resident Evil fame. The Regenerator can't be killed by normal means, regenerates lost limbs in seconds, and it stalks you through 2 entire chapters of the game. Its presence completely changes the pacing of the gameplay from one of suspense and caution to a frantic non-stop chase scene. Too bad it's not in the game that long, but at least it doesn't wear out its welcome. The only problem with the enemies I have is that generally the larger necromorphs are less scary, because they don't resemble humans anymore and are just giant masses of flesh. But overall, Dead Space is a very strong variety of horrifying foes ready to tear you limb from limb. Next up, level design. Doom 3 once again drops the ball severely in this category, using nonsensical immersion-breaking hidden compartments and walls to get cheap jump scares on you. I would be lying if I said I didn't jump out of my seat a few times, but we're talking like 3 times out of over 100. It is comical that they expect us to believe a Martian research base would have 100 human-sized compartments in the walls, and that zombies and imps would just wait patiently inside until you walk past, and then pop out and say, "Boo!" It gets old fast. Not to mention the designers love to constantly spawn enemies behind you, and I mean constantly. When demons spawn in, there's a very distinct whispering sound followed by thunder, so it's not like it takes you by surprise, it's just annoying and cheap. The actual environments themselves look pretty good for a game over 15 years old. The main problem is that the game drags on too long for how many different areas it has to show you. In between cool highlights like the surface of Mars, teleporter testing labs, and hell itself, we have literally hundreds of identical hallways and ventilation shafts connecting rooms together. It makes navigation a nightmare because everything looks the same. One area that was improved in the BFG edition, which convinces me it's the only remotely playable version of the game, is the incredibly pitch black darkness covering the corners of many rooms. In the original release, the flashlight was a separate weapon that you had to switch to. I can't even imagine how much that must have slowed down the pacing. In BFG edition, the flashlight is attached to your armor, so you can toggle it with a button press. This has a side effect of nullifying the challenge of the escort missions where you protect a robot with a flashlight, but honestly, I don't care. The darkness seems so unnatural outside of these escort areas. It makes sense in rooms that have no light source, but there are plenty of instances where the shadows cast by objects in the light literally cover the room in darkness. Look, I get that lighting was primitive back then, but this is ridiculous. It's just another excuse to shove more jump scares in your face. Doom 3 nails the sci-fi aesthetic, but fails the more important aspect, suspense. Doom 3 has basically no downtime from fights. There's very little build up to encounters, even with new enemies. Like I said before, it's like the devs thought you would get bored if they weren't constantly shoving shit in your face. Nearly every room in the game has an enemy in it. The few times you aren't fighting, you're just searching the area for medkits and ammo. There's very little environmental storytelling, unless you count blood, scattered corpses, and the occasional pentagram. Pretty much a failing grade in every aspect of level design. Dead Space does a much better job, but still suffers from its own repetition issues. Enemies travel through vents, xenomorph style, which personally I find infinitely more scary than wall compartments, even if it technically counts as a jump scare. The difference is that in Dead Space, the encounters aren't completely scripted. The necromorphs will try to find the vent closest to you, meaning that previous playthroughs won't help you memorize enemy spawns, but room layouts are actually far more important. Occasionally enemies can be found wandering rooms when you walk in, and even more rarely, playing dead. Guaranteed to make you shit your pants the first time. The environmental design in Dead Space is absolutely fantastic. The USG Ishimura is one of those iconic locations in gaming that is so detailed and well built that it feels real, like it could actually exist far in the future. Every essential component of a massive corporate sci-fi mining spaceship is explored in detail, thanks to the genius design decision to theme each chapter after a different section of the ship. You'll explore hydroponics, the medical deck, crew quarters, hangars, engineering, and more. Even without the necromorphs, the ship itself can be creepy as you discover that there are infants being grown for emergency organ replacements. Some sections of the ship are distressingly loud as well, which both makes me panic internally and serves as sound cover for necromorphs to sneak behind you. The only weak point in the overall design is that the devs reuse the medical deck and bridge in later chapters, but you visit new areas in each one, so it's not too bad. Enemy encounters are pretty common, not Doom 3 level of excessive, but most rooms and probably half of the hallways have enemies appear in them at some point. Dead Space keeps things interesting by throwing in zero-gravity segments with puzzles and contamination lockdown sequences where you're trapped in a room and have to face an onslaught of enemies. It's also important to note that there are actually moments of eerie quiet and tense buildup. Although necromorphs attack you in most rooms, they rarely do so immediately, and sometimes they never appear at all. These small moments where they subvert your expectations are essential to maintaining tension. There's a fair amount of environmental storytelling beyond the typical corpse pile and streaks of blood. While fixing the ship, you'll encounter a number of survivors driven to insanity by the effects of the Marker, the mysterious alien artifact found on the planet below. The gruesome scenes that follow are both disturbing and informative to the nature of how the outbreak started and just how powerful the Marker's effect is on the human mind. The ominous sight of the crew quarters, covered in corpses with wrapped up heads and matching holes in their skulls, shows the deranged, evangelical believers of unitology and the lengths they'll go to achieve their ascension by being transformed into disgusting monsters. Naturally, I stomped their corpses into bloody chunks to prevent this. Speaking of bloody chunks, gore is another effective tool of horror. Not scary necessarily, but a constant reminder of the horrible fate that awaits you. Doom 3 has a fair bit, especially in Hell, where disfigured and dismembered bodies are nailed to the walls. Your weapons can cause some serious damage as well, reducing dead enemies to giblets with a grenade or shotgun blast. Unfortunately, the same does not extend to the player character. When you die, you just die. No cutscene, no animation of your head being ripped off or blown up or anything remotely creative or interesting. Dead Space, though, turned gore into an art form. Okay, maybe I'm exaggerating, but seriously, gore is one of the game's main features. Visceral Software's dedication to making dismemberment a major game mechanic is a big part of what gives the game its identity. Not only is dismemberment the most effective way to kill a necromorph, but everything you can do to them, they can do to you. Pretty much every enemy has a unique animation for killing Isaac, with decapitation being their favorite method. Here's just a taste of them. Wasn't that awesome? I wish more games put that kind of polish into death scenes. I think story is worth a brief mention. I say brief not because story isn't important, but because Doom 3 doesn't have a fucking story. And I think part of the fun of Dead Space is trying to figure out the story for yourself by reading and listening to the various logs you find throughout your journey. Not to mention the twists thrown at the end, I definitely don't want to spoil those. So for Doom 3, we're given a short text crawl and intro cinematic to set the stage as we take control of the new Doom guy, a recruit sent to Mars. After punching some turkeys, you meet up with your commanding officer and are assigned to find a missing scientist in the decommissioned comms facility. Once you find him, all hell breaks loose, and it's up to you to stop the demon invasion. The obviously evil scientist you see at the beginning opened the portal to hell, and you've got to close it. That's pretty much it. Dead Space's story isn't particularly complicated either. You play as an engineer named Isaac Clarke, part of a team sent to respond to the USG Ishimura's distress call. What is thought to be a simple repair job turns out to be an alien parasite that transforms the dead into weaponized zombies. Everyone on board appears to be dead or mentally damaged beyond saving. With nobody on board to maintain the ship, it's received extensive damage from both negligence and the strange alien growths everywhere. It's up to you to travel to each section of the ship and repair the various life-threatening damages it has sustained. As you progress through the story, you discover the marker recovered from the planet is somehow the source of the necromorphs, and the only way to stop it is to return it to the surface. The backstory of the outbreak and how everything went to shit is explained in text and audio logs found as you explore the ship. It's expanded even further in Dead Space Downfall, an animated movie that's actually pretty good, but completely unnecessary to understand the story. Now, to be fair, Doom 3 has audio logs too. Problem is, they're incredibly boring. This is because all they talk about is menial tasks they perform on the base. The only reason you'll ever use your PDA is to listen for precious locker codes. Last, but certainly not least, is sound design. I think Doom 3 actually has a strong ambient soundtrack and some creepy background sound effects, like whispers luring you to your death, and the occasional screams of torment. The demons themselves sound about how you'd expect, not scary to me personally, but maybe that scares some people. The zombies, though, just sound like mouth-breathing morons. We're talking borderline parody here. It seriously breaks my immersion completely. Another counterproductive sound decision is the trademarked whispers and thunder that telegraph demon spawns. Not only is said sound effect extremely overused, but the summoning animation is so slow that it gives you time to run up to the demon and unload buckshot into its skull before it can strike back. I think the problem here is self-explanatory. If you spent less time fighting and more time wandering the bloody halls of Mars City, the spooky ambience might have time to set in. But like I said before, there are too many goddamn fights in this game. For Dead Space, I'll just let the game speak for itself. Yeah, I might be biased, but listen to that shit. That's what a horror game should sound like. problem with action horror fundamentally is that the player can become too skilled or too powerful for the monsters that you throw at them, eliminating the fear factor completely. On repeat playthroughs, this is pretty much inevitable, because even if you're bad at the game, you'll still know it's coming. So once the fear is gone, all you're left with is game mechanics. This is why, unless you're developing another hide-and-seek simulator, you still need to make your game fun. Of course, as you figured out by now, I don't think Doom 3 is fun. In fact, Doom 3 is the worst thing a video game can be. Boring. I would rather the game be a giant pile of shit, but hilarious, like Sonic 06, than a bore fest like Resident Evil 6. I'm beginning to sound like a broken record here, but there are way too many combat encounters in Doom 3. There's 4 reasons I've come to this conclusion. 1. The shooting is overly simplistic. 2. Half of the weapons serve the same function. 3. The same basic enemy types are overused. And 4. The game is too easy. In terms of shooting mechanics, the main problems are that there's no recoil, the weapons are unbalanced, and there's an overabundance of ammo. Once you pick up an assault rifle, there's no reason to ever use the pistol again, and even the shotgun barely competes at close range. The assault rifle is so powerful and accurate that the chain gun only does more damage at close range due to its excessive spread. Your first real upgrade is the plasma gun, and even then, the slow projectile speed means that the assault rifle outperforms it at long range. The only weapons better than the AR outright are the rocket launcher and BFG. To put this into perspective, a weapon you find in the second level is basically tied for the third best weapon in the game and essentially has infinite ammo. This ties into the second problem, because the AR, chain gun, and plasma gun are basically just slight tweaks on the same weapon. You can use them interchangeably with no consequences. Honestly, I only ever used the chain gun when I was tired of the other two, which shouldn't even be an option. It's like the devs forgot about the survival part of survival horror. It's not just ammo that's too plentiful, but health and armor as well. In fact, I can probably count the number of times on one hand I drop below 75 armor. Near the end of the game, you get access to the Soul Cube, an artifact from hell that automatically kills any normal enemy you throw it at, healing you to full health. It recharges with every 5 kills, making you basically immortal. What makes things worse is the sheer number of zombies, possessed soldiers, and imps that you face. The enemy variety is actually not bad on paper, but the rare types of demons are either underused or underpowered. The imps are just a joke. They are such a non-threat at range, it's pathetic. Their fireballs fly in slow, predictable arcs, and they're usually dead before they can close the distance. The possessed soldiers are boring, but at least they can dish out some damage. The zombies are zombies. Meh. On the subject of difficulty, look, I get that this is a highly subjective issue, but I played the game on veteran, and rarely were the enemies ever a threat. And not because of abusing dominant strategy or cheap exploits. I died more times from exploding barrels, falling off the map, and my own grenades than the enemies ever brought me below 25 health. Just strafing, taking cover, and backing away while shooting will be more than sufficient tactics to defeat the hellish horde. The few times you'll come close to death is when the game cheaply spawns enemies completely surrounding you in a small room. Shitty design to say the least. Even if somehow you think cranking the enemy health and damage to ridiculous levels will fix the combat's numerous problems, Nightmare is locked until you've beaten the game, so hopefully Veteran is enough for you. As you can imagine from the tone of this video, I love Dead Space, and the combat is a large part of why. Glenn Schofield revealed that when Resident Evil 4 released, development on Dead Space completely shifted to have combat similar to it. And I might have a little bit of experience with RE4. But the developers didn't just stop there. On top of slow, methodical, gratifying third-person shooting controls, with the ability to move and shoot for those annoyed by standing still, you're given kinesis, which allows you to throw objects and dead necromorph limbs as weapons, and stasis, which lets you severely slow down machines and enemies temporarily. But all of this would be nothing without the gunplay. The decision to make the necromorphs weak to dismemberment is both genius and incredibly satisfying in combat. It both serves as an explanation as to how the security forces failed so miserably to kill them, and as a great excuse to make the game's weapons unique, yet somewhat believable for a sci-fi engineer to have access to. You've got tools that fire plasma for cutting rocks, a blowtorch, a floating buzzsaw, a kinesis-powered machine for pushing heavy objects, a beam cannon of sorts for blasting apart huge rocks, and for some reason, an assault rifle. The enemy variety is fairly strong as well. While you get more than your fair share of slashers, leapers, and lurkers, encounters will mix in pregnants, dividers, twitchers, brutes, and more. Enemies drop ammo and cash upon death, making combat feel rewarding instead of just a waste of resources. It all makes for a sandbox that is highly replayable and just plain fun, if you're not paralyzed by fear. But even I have to admit, it has a couple problems. Skip to this part of the video if you haven't played Dead Space, because I'm about to break the combat. Alright, let's get right to it. The plasma cutter is overpowered. Not just, it's pretty strong for a starting weapon OP, but it's literally the best gun in the game OP. I'm confident that it deserves the silver medal for most powerful pistol in a video game, with the gold going to the Halo 1 Magnum. It deals solid damage, can slice off limbs with ease, has a high rate of fire, and infinite range. So while the early chapters of the game will tempt you with schematics for the pulse rifle, line gun, ripper, and flamethrower, don't bother with any of them. The pulse rifle shouldn't even be in the game. You saw firsthand how useless it was against the necromorphs. It takes 2/3 of a magazine to kill one slasher. Also, the secondary fire is just, well, look at it. The flamethrower is probably the second worst, having very little stopping power and a weak burning effect that only lasts a few seconds. Every other weapon is somewhat viable, but not nearly as ammo efficient as the plasma cutter. If you funnel most of your money into power cores, you can upgrade the plasma cutter's damage to kill a slasher in 3 hits, 2 to sever the leg, then 1 to the arm. Since the ammo drops in packs of 6, you'll never run out. The only other weapon nearly as useful is the force gun, which despite being advertised as a pushing device, it's powerful enough to blow enemy limbs straight off. It's the closest thing to a shotgun in the game, and it even launches concussion grenades with its alt fire. Between these two weapons, you've got all the bases covered. While you could totally use the Ripper, line gun, and contact beam and still kick some ass, on higher difficulties you'll just be making things harder on yourself. Those 3 weapons each have a weakness that holds it back from being practical for general use. Dominant strategy is a cruel mistress, and I am a slave to her temptations. The only other problem I have is the propensity to fall into a combat loop, where the beginning of every fight starts with kneecapping all of the necromorphs to slow them down, and then finishing them off. I wish there was more of a reason to aim for the arms first, but outside of a few slashers wearing armored pants, yes, they really have metal pants, you might as well sweep the legs first. Other than these issues, the gameplay loop is fantastic, and I love spending all of the cash dropped on armor upgrades and power cores, which are used to improve your weapons, health, kinesis, and stasis. Progression is a key part of fun for me in video games. One thing that neither game completely pulls off is boss fights. In Doom 3, they don't have nearly enough health. Most boss fights won't last longer than a couple minutes, if that. So instead of increasing their health, id Software cranked their damage to absurd levels, and in the case of your mutated commanding officer, can kill you with 2 BFG shots that are nearly impossible to dodge. The final boss is infinitely easier by comparison. Since you can only damage him with the Soul Cube, he spawns weak demons to feed your cube, and you can just run in a huge circle to avoid all of his attacks. Pathetically easy. Dead Space's problem is that all of the bosses except the Regenerator are just massive bullet sponges. The final boss also breaks my immersion a bit, because it's not in any way believable that you stand a chance. They chose generic boss fight design number 12, which is basically really big guy leans over a platform and tries to smash you. Kind of a disappointing conclusion.
Oh my god!
Although I've talked a lot of shit about Doom 3, it's not a terrible game. It's just a highly mediocre, repetitive shooter in a space-themed haunted house. If you really want to play a Doom game, play Doom 2016. It's fun as hell and actually faithful to the original while breathing new life into the FPS genre. And with the release of Doom Eternal, we've now got 2 amazing Doom games in a single console generation. That never happens anymore. If you absolutely have to play Doom 3, play the Resurrection of Evil expansion. It removes a lot of the horror elements, but adds the super shotgun, a discount gravity gun, and an artifact that becomes more powerful as you defeat bosses. It's only 4 hours long, just enough time to experience everything it has to offer without becoming a slog. If you want to play an amazing action horror game, play Resident Evil 4. After that, play Dead Space. Dead Space puts a lot more emphasis on horror, but RE4 is unparalleled in level design and has top-notch shooting mechanics. If you want an explanation in detail, watch my review on it. Both games are truly masterpieces and hold a special place in my heart. Unfortunately, unlike Resident Evil, Dead Space as a franchise has faded away in the public consciousness. Part of that was due to Dead Space 3 being a disappointment. The rest was due to the gaming industry's boogeyman. While Dead Space 3 was a significant step down from the first 2, that was thanks to the insatiable greed of EA. And when it underperformed, EA shut down Visceral Games and shelved Dead Space indefinitely. I know horror is a niche genre, but I can't help but dream that someday Dead Space will return. The fact that the trilogy was never remastered tells me it's never gonna happen, but I can't help but hold on to a sliver of hope. Dead Space deserved better. Don't believe me? See for yourself. I don't throw around the term masterpiece lightly. Every gaming enthusiast owes it to themselves to experience the greatest games of all time. That's why you should play Dead Space. If you made it this far, thanks for watching. If you liked the video, give it a like. If you hated it, give it a dislike and write a lengthy comment explaining why Doom 3 is the scariest game ever and Dead Space is boring and overrated. I might even read it. What are some games you guys believe to be the greatest of all time? I originally was just going to insult Doom 3 for 20 minutes, but realized that Dead Space pulled off exactly what Doom 3 failed. Feel free to tell me if this slightly different style worked out or not. For all 3 of you that remembered that I was making a Hat in Time video, that's still in the works. I had to delay it again for this video. It'll be next though, I promise. See you next time, guys.